Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today's lecture, we're going to kind of pick up where we left off last time, kind of moving into the Civil War itself and explaining what's going on there, right? And what its eventual outcome is. No spoiler alerts here, but it doesn't go well for one side, as we all know. So what we're going to be doing here today is just kind of picking up where we left off and actually looking at the course of the war itself. Now, one thing to kind of keep in mind in these really big survey courses is we really can't get deep into any single thing, right? I mean, in some colleges, they teach classes just on the run up to the Civil War, right? Others, they have classes just on the Civil War itself, where they spend 15 or 16 weeks looking at the entire Civil War. We obviously can't do that. So I'm just going to give you a really quick tour of the Civil War, look at a few famous battles and why they're important, and then, of course, kind of look at the immediate aftermath of the war as we get to it, okay? So that's kind of what's on tap in this lecture. So as we move into this, kind of keep in mind what we were looking at last time. This war, at first, both sides thought they were going to win it handily very easily. But in the end, it's not going to be that easy for either side to win this war. It is going to be a long, knockdown, drag-out fight, right? But the North does have a plan here to deal with this breakaway part of the country called the Confederacy, right? They're going to raise massive armies out of the North. And again, the North has the industrial power, the wealth, the population to actually pull this off. But does it have the will to do it, right? As troops die, as Confederates keep fighting to hold on to their new country, right? Will the North keep pushing even when they lose? So the plan here for the North is to tear the Confederacy apart. Raise troops out west, split the Confederacy from east to west. Raise troops in the east and just dominate the eastern seaboard. Crush the most developed southern states, the richest southern states, and just tear apart the Confederacy that way. So into this, we're going to look at some of the battles that define this war, right? We're going to look at one of the big early battles that really shows just how deadly this war is going to be and also has a big impact on what the real cause of this war is, of course, slavery, right? And then we're going to take a look at what's going on out west along the Mississippi River and why that's important. And then we're going to culminate with really the most important battle of the war at a place in Pennsylvania called Gettysburg and what that means for the South when they lose that battle. So let's kind of take our tour here of what's going on in the first year and a half of the war, about a year and a half or so of the war, and then what comes out of one of these first big battles that's known as the Battle of Antietam. Okay? All right, so before we get to that battle, we have to kind of understand what's happening here, right? As I kind of mentioned in the last lecture, as the lines are being drawn here, as people are choosing sides, are you with the Confederacy, are you with the federal government? That's got to happen on an individual basis. And a lot of Southerners are people like Robert E. Lee. He's a famous military figure in United States history. He was a former commandant of West Point, so he was the guy that helped train military leaders in the U.S. Army, right? Officers in the U.S. Army. He was a hero in the war with Mexico. That's where he had kind of gotten his start as a military career officer. So this guy was a well-known household name for a lot of military people in the United States in the 1850s and 60s. As a matter of fact, during the war, as it becomes evident that the Union is going to have to fight the Confederacy to prove that this is still one country, Lincoln goes to Robert E. Lee and says, "Hey, look, you're well respected. Everybody thinks you're a great leader. Will you take command of the U.S. military, the U.S. Army, and crush the Confederacy for me?" And Lee says, "I'm honored that you would ask me to, but I'm going to stick with my state. I'm going to go with Virginia." Now, at the time, Virginia hadn't made a decision as to what side it was on. But within the next couple of days, it was pretty clear Virginia was going to join the Confederacy. This guy, Robert E. Lee, quits the U.S. Army. He resigns his commission and asks for a commission in the Confederate Army. He personally knows Jefferson Davis, gets to know him even better as the war kind of unfolds in the first year or so. And pretty quickly, Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, keeps promoting Lee up through the ranks and eventually asks Lee to take over command of one of the most important armies in the South, the Army of Northern Virginia. The Army of Northern Virginia's job is to protect Virginia, really the most important of the southern states, and make sure the North doesn't conquer it. That's where the capital of the Confederacy is. Lee has to defend that state. When Lee becomes the commander of the Confederate Army in North Virginia, though, he understands something. The North has a lot of people, has a lot of industrial power. As Commandant of West Point is a town in New York. New York is one of those rapidly industrializing states in the 1840s and 50s. He lived there in the 1850s, and he saw just what the North was capable of. And he understood that if the North keeps fighting, the South's going to lose. They just don't have enough people. They don't have enough guns. They don't have enough ammunition. It's just not going to work out for the South. Lee felt the only way the South was really going to win this war is if the North quit fighting. That it was really about breaking the Northern will to fight, not taking away their factories or anything like that. So in the end, Lee is going to come up with this idea of invading the North, proving to Northerners that the North couldn't win this war, that the South was just too powerful, too strong, and that it was best to just make a deal with them. But he's going to need so many soldiers to do this. He's going to strip the Confederacy of soldiers, especially out west. And his idea of going on the offense, of taking the war to the North, means that at times Southerners are going to take as many casualties as Northerners, and that's bad for the South because they just don't have as many people. They can't replace those losses that quickly. Well, all of this comes home in one moment here in 1862. After about a year and a half of fighting, right, one of these moments happens. Lee has decided in September of 1862, after kind of holding off the first round of northern attacks on Virginia, that now's the time to take the war to the North. Prove to people in Pennsylvania and Maryland that there's no way the North's going to win this war. His secret hope here is that he's going to take his army from Northern Virginia, swing up through Maryland into Pennsylvania, threaten Philadelphia maybe, force the Union Army to go and block him there, and then he's going to turn and take Washington, D.C. Prove that the federal government can't even protect its own seat of power, that Northerners shouldn't be behind Lincoln in the war effort. So he puts this plan into action. He calls together his generals, he issues orders, he brings together about 40,000 Confederate troops and launches them into the North. Unfortunately for Lee, some of his battle plans, some of his orders to his generals are actually lost, right? They're dropped by one of his couriers, and it's picked up by a Union soldier by the name of Barton Mitchell. He turns it over to his superiors who look at this going, hey, we have Lee's battle plans here. We know where he's going and we know when he's going to be there. We can crush him. But as it goes up the chain of command, Northern generals are convinced this must be some kind of trap. It's some kind of ploy to trick them into a crushing defeat, and they don't use the information. But pretty quickly it comes to everybody's attention that, yeah, Lee actually is attacking the North, and yes, the Union Army needs to go stop him. And they slowly but surely kind of respond to this attack by Lee. And in a place called Antietam, a little village in Maryland, southern Maryland, these two armies, huge in size by comparison to anything that happened in previous wars in the United States, come crashing into each other. A Union army of about 75,000 soldiers takes on a Confederate army of about 40,000 troops. Now, luckily for Lee, he gets to be on the defensive here, which means the Union troops have to force him to go back. He can kind of pick and choose where and when to fight, and that's going to give him a bit of an advantage here. But you're going to notice something when you look at the battle casualties here. There are going to be 12,000 total casualties for the North, 10,000 for the Confederacy. 2,000 dead for the North, 1,500 dead for the South. As it stands to this day, it is one of the deadliest days in the history of this country. More Americans die in one day in this battle than any day during World War II or even World War I Vietnam, anything, right? Even 9/11, not as many Americans died in one day as they did at this Battle of Antietam, because Americans are fighting Americans here. The dead on both sides are Americans. So this battle does show just how brutal this conflict is going to be, how important it is to be able to marshal your military power here, right? But one thing else is also going to come out of this. Those numbers, they're clearly worse for the North than they are for the South, but they're not that different if you stop and think about it. The North can easily replace 12,000 soldiers who are killed, missing, or wounded. For the Confederacy, they'll be able to replace them for a while, but they can't keep doing this, right? But that's the only way they're going to win this war, is to keep fighting battles like this. So we kind of see from the very beginning, as long as the North can keep going, even if it's losing battles, it's going to kind of get what it wants in the end. It's going to force the Confederacy to retreat and retreat, because that's what happens here. The Confederacy is able to hold off the Union troops. In the end, they kill more and wound more Northerners than happens to Southerners. But when the Union Army shows up, it is just so big, the South has to retreat. Lee is forced to go back into Virginia. He can't attack Washington, D.C. He can't attack Pennsylvania. In the end, he gets nothing out of this. So it's not much of a victory for the North, but it is the first battle that they can claim as a victory. And what's really important about this battle, besides just showing just how deadly this war is going to be, right, is it does something else. It gives the President of the United States a chance to do something he's actually wanted to do since the war began. He issues a thing called the Emancipation Proclamation. Just a few days after the battles, the news of the battle goes out, Lincoln dusts off something that he's written months earlier, that members of his cabinet know he's been waiting to do. He says that he's going to emancipate people, right? So who's affected by this Emancipation Proclamation? Who's freed by the federal government? Does Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation free all slaves in the Union? Does it free all slaves in the Confederacy? Does it free all slaves, period, North and South? Or is it something else? Well, what it ends up doing is it does something that Lincoln doesn't actually have the power to do. It frees slaves in the Confederacy, not in the Union. So we have to kind of ask ourselves, why is Lincoln doing this? The one place he has no real authority right now is in the Confederacy. Why not free slaves in the Union? Well, if he issues this Emancipation Proclamation, he says, as of now, all slaves in Missouri, Kentucky, and parts of Virginia that were under our control, and Maryland that's under our control, are now freed. Well, the white slave owners in those territories will fight for the Confederacy, fight harder for the Confederacy. And even some white non-slave owners might say, hey, I don't want to free slaves. That's not what I'm fighting for here. And they may quit supporting the Union. So in the end, he issues this proclamation to kind of as a warning, if you will, for the South, to kind of point out that ultimately this war is about slavery. And the longer it goes on, the more we're going to have to deal with that issue, especially if the North wins. If the North wins, it means they are going to end slavery. This is kind of the writing on the wall for Southerners. And of course, it's just going to mean Southerners are going to dig in deeper. But it also kind of broadens the concept of the war. The first year here, most Northerners are all saying, we're here to preserve the country. But Lincoln's saying, well, we're not only preserving the country, but we're also going to have to deal with this big problem of slavery down the road. That's part of what's at all of this, right? But in the end, what we're really kind of seeing is that this is kind of a war aim, if you will, right? It's kind of like Dunmore's proclamation during the American Revolution. Remember, the British Governor Lord Dunmore at that time in 1775, as things are starting to look really bad for the British government, issues this proclamation that says, hey, if slaves run over to our side, the British side will help you out. Because that takes away wealth, it takes away power from the patriots, who were a lot of Southern patriots were wealthy slave owners, right? It takes wealth and power from them and gives it to the British. Well, Lincoln is kind of doing the equivalent here, right? He's trying to say to Southern slaves, not Northern slaves, but Southern slaves, join us, right? Come to us. In the end, it's not particularly popular with Northerners or Southerners. A lot of Northerners didn't like the idea of making slavery a part of the war, right? They wanted to just focus on the national aspect of just holding the country together. That the Republican Party is going to get a little hurt by this. A lot of people say, I'm not going to vote for Republicans anymore because they've been Democrats, right? And they were just sided with the Republicans because the Republicans were trying to hold the country together. In the end, though, it is a big moment. It does promise freedom, even if it's not really tangible for most people, right? For 4 million slaves in the South now, there's a reason to leave your plantation. There's some place to go. Go find a Northern army, and you can find freedom. So for a lot of people outside of the North, this is a big deal, right? White Southerners say, this is what we knew was going to happen eventually anyways. Let's fight harder. For Black Southerners, it's finally we have a chance to end this awful institution. Finally, we have a real shot at freedom here. So why has Lincoln changed his mind here in 1862, right? This thing is officially going to go into effect in 1863. It essentially says, Southerners, you have 3 months to come to your senses here, right? Give up on this war, come back, rejoin the country, and this thing goes away, and we're not freeing any slaves. But if it goes on past that, then I'm going to start freeing slaves, and we're going to start doing something about slavery in this country. Well, in the end, he kind of has to. From the very beginning, as we've already talked about, slavery has been the issue behind this war in the first place. And as the war starts taking place, you, a Union general, have to decide what you're going to do as you start conquering parts of the South, right? Remember, the North has to go in and conquer the South. So as Northern armies go into the South, places like Tennessee, places like Arkansas and Florida and Virginia, what do is you take over a plantation, and now there's suddenly hundreds of slaves who want their freedom. Well, one Union general by the name of Ulysses S. Grant said, ostensibly our objective here is to protect the property of citizens whose property was invaded. What he's saying here is at the very beginning of the war, even Ulysses S. Grant is saying, hey, look, we're not going to do anything. We're not going to free these people. We're just going to hold them here on their plantations until we can decide what to do with them. But that becomes bigger and bigger of an issue, right? Especially as the North needs more and more people to get things done. As they're sending more and more troops into combat, they need people to wash clothes for them. They need people to cut down trees for them, to provide wood so they can have fires, to clear roads. Who do they start turning to? More and more, they start turning to those slaves that are sitting around, don't have a lot to do right now, right? They don't have to work on the plantations. Their white owners don't have control over them right now. So what do you do with them? Put them to work for you, right? Pay them, use them as paid labor like you would with anybody else. And some soldiers started kind of getting the sense that, hey, we need to kind of deal with this, right? Some soldiers are being ordered by their commanders, even people like Grant by the next year or so, right? This is, Grant's idea that we just kind of hands off on the issue of slavery in the first year. But by the second year, he's telling his soldiers, hey, go in there into these southern plantations and don't worry about it. Take all their property, right? Take their land, take their house, take their silverware and plates, take everything, including their slaves, and we'll use it for us against them, right? For Grant and his lieutenants, his sub-commanders, people like William Sherman, it was time they felt that Southerners began to understand what war is really like, right? Just how bad it is to be on the wrong side of a war. And this ties in well with the Emancipation Proclamation, right? It's a way to weaken the South and bring more power, more wealth, more resources to the Union, to the North, right? As Northern armies go farther and farther into the South, the one group of people they can count on helping them, showing them how to get someplace, where the Southern troops are runaway slaves, right? Black Southerners are going to help the Union, help find supplies for them, help tell them the right way to go, be guides for them, right? They are an incredible resource for the North, and the North starts utilizing it here by 1862. And Lincoln's just kind of coming to the point where this is something that has to be done, right? We need to do this. And honestly, it's been that way almost from the beginning. One of the early commanders, a guy that ran for president in 1856 for the Republicans, John Fremont, he's in Missouri. He's saying, hey, let's use slaves to help build forts, to help build roads, to help grow food, right? Let's free them, pay them, and utilize them for our side. General David Hunter, he's landed by the U.S. Navy on the coast of North Carolina and South Carolina and eventually Florida. As he moves inland and he takes over southern plantations, he says, let's use these slaves. Now, originally, Lincoln goes against their orders and says, no, 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 don't do that. You'll just make border states, places like Kentucky and Maryland, want to join the Confederacy. It'll make it harder to bring the South back into the North. But after a year and a half of fighting, Lincoln understands two things. First of all, Northerners are starting to get the idea that slavery is really the thing that has to be dealt with here. And the other part of it is that the fight has gotten too deep and it's lasted too long. It's not going to be easy to bring the South in anyway. So you might as well use all the resources you've got. And the numbers here are starting to get staggering, right? This is an issue that can't be ignored any longer. By 1862, there are more than 100,000 former slaves that have run away to the Union armies, right? And they're following along behind these Union armies. They don't have any place to go. Their only homes were these plantations where they were enslaved, right? So they follow along behind the Union in what are called contraband camps, right? Again, Northerners can't call them people yet because it's not official. We haven't really dealt with the issue of what slavery is and what slaves are or aren't here, right? But one of the things we do see is coming down out of the North, a lot of women especially come down into these contraband camps to provide services, to be teachers, to help them organize themselves, to help provide legal expertise, medical expertise, right? A lot of people are saying, hey, look, this is a problem we have to deal with. So in a way, Lincoln is kind of seeing the country come to his position, right? Slowly but surely, a lot of Northerners that weren't excited about having slavery becoming an issue in the war are now kind of reluctantly accepting the fact that this is something that they have to deal with. And for Lincoln, it even becomes a bigger issue than that, right? Than just kind of a war aim. This is about really destroying the Confederacy. The easiest way to destroy the Confederacy is to destroy slavery. Take those millions of slaves in the South and use them for the North against the South. And that is literally going to be the case at some times, right? More than 180,000 black men are going to join the Union Army, most of them from those contraband camps, saying, hey, look, give me a gun, give me a uniform, I'll fight with you. Just end slavery. Let me free my family, free my friends, get into this awful institution. So in a big way, the Emancipation Proclamation, it complicates the war, right? It makes some white Southerners want to fight harder, longer, right? It makes some white Northerners say, well, I'm not as interested in this war now. But for the most part, it is coming to grips with the reality of the war, that something's going to have to be done with slavery, that it can't be ignored like we've been ignoring it for the past 60 years in this country. So the Emancipation Proclamation is a big moment, and the only reason it can really exist is because the Union finally wins, although it's kind of a dubious victory, it does win a victory at the Battle of Antietam, right? So again, the physical war is at times having a big impact on kind of the political war in this country, right? And I guess maybe a way to kind of sum all of this up is to kind of look at a quote, interview from one of these escaped slaves, one of these contrabands as they're known in the early 1860s during the first years of the war. A guy by the name of Prince Rivers. He was a slave in Tennessee that runs away to the Union Army, and then he wants to join the Army, right? He wants to fight for his freedom. He kind of sums it up this way. Now we're men, right? Now, for the first time in our lives, we can look our old masters in the face. They used to sell and whip us, and we could not say a word, right? Now we're not afraid. He understands what this war is about, right? It's about acknowledging the fact that people are people, they're not property. And that is an issue that's being dealt with slowly and reluctantly, but still being dealt with here during the war, right? So now we're going to turn our attention to the Western theater of war, as it's sometimes called, right? Actually, this is an area where the Northern forces saw their most success early on in the war. Sometimes the Union commanders out there were a little bit better. The Confederate commanders weren't as good as they were in the East. Lee had a habit of kind of keeping the best and the brightest around him, so his army was really tough. But that meant that the rest of the Confederate army wasn't maybe as capable or have as many resources as he did. So out west is where the North sees a lot of early victories, where its plans are kind of best being realized, if you will, right? And we're going to turn our attention to kind of that theater for a minute, kind of see what's happening there, why the Union's doing what it's doing, and then take a look at one of the battles that really defines what's going on here militarily in the war, right? So again, kind of keep in mind that one of the things the Union knows it needs to do is gain control of the Mississippi River. First of all, to cut off states like Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas from the rest of the Confederacy, but also to gain control of the Mississippi River so states like Missouri and Kentucky and Tennessee have a way to trade with the rest of the world, right? The Ohio River can work, but it's going upriver. It's much easier to transport goods downriver. So by taking control of the Mississippi, you not only harm the Confederacy, but you once again open up a huge trade route for the rest of the interior part of the country. So to do this, to make sure places like Missouri and Kentucky stay loyal to the Union, don't join the Confederacy, huge armies are being raised out west, right? In places like Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri, you see armies of 10, 50, even 100,000 in size being raised by the North. It is staggering just how many people the North brings into the military. At times forced to use a draft to do it, but they're able to bring a huge number of forces to bear on the South. And of course, the mission out here in the West is to take the Mississippi River. And slowly but surely, about 100,000 Union troops under the command of various generals, but really the one that's doing the kind of the groundwork here, the one that's really kind of on the main commander at the point of conflict is Ulysses S. Grant and his main sub-commander, William Sherman. They're the ones that are doing a lot of the fighting. The people that are in charge of them, like Halleck and others, they come and go. But Grant and Sherman are the ones that are leading most of the fighting out here, along with William Thomas and a few other generals. But they have about 100,000 Union troops up against about 70,000 Confederate troops. But kind of keep in mind, a lot of those Confederate troops are spread out over 3 or 4 states. The Union's able to bring 100,000 to bear at any given point they want to fight, and then they still have other troops to kind of keep the Confederates busy in other areas. So this really is one of the reasons why the North's doing well out here. So many troops for the Confederacy is going east to help Lee that it doesn't leave a lot out here in the West to keep the Union off of them. So slowly but surely, places like Tennessee are being conquered. Even parts of Missouri and Kentucky are easily in Union hands now, right? And there's by 1862, 1863, there's really no question of Missouri or Kentucky leaving the Union and joining the Confederacy now, right? Even after the Emancipation Proclamation's issued, Kentucky doesn't quit, right? Doesn't join the Confederacy. That moment's kind of past now during this point. It's another reason why Lincoln can feel kind of like he can do the Emancipation Proclamation, because he's got better control over these states now. And as these forces for the Union kind of flow out west, right, you kind of see they start winning. The U.S. Navy brings a small army into New Orleans Harbor and captures New Orleans, cutting off the mouth of the Mississippi River for the Confederacy. To the north of that, and Memphis, Tennessee, is taken in June of 1862 by Grant and his army. So slowly but surely, the Confederacy is losing control of the Mississippi River and is about to be split in two. And one of the people that understands that is one of the commanders for the Confederacy out in the West, a guy by the name of General Albert Sidney Johnston. He's got about 40,000 men, And he knows that slowly but surely the North is going to keep working its way down the Mississippi, link up these two armies, and then it's pretty much over, right? The Union will be able to kind of drive into Mississippi and Alabama and then Louisiana and Texas, and there's not much the Confederacy is going to be able to do about it. They just don't have enough forces. So here in early 1862, in April of 1862, before even the Battle of Antietam takes place, Albert Sidney Johnston decides he'd better do something now while he still has the manpower to do it, while things are still a little balanced, right? So he gathers up about 40,000 Confederate troops, and he knows that the Union Army is kind of strung out at this point in southern Tennessee. And he decides to hit part of it that's the most isolated, near a small town in southern Tennessee called Shiloh. Now, at the time, the Union forces didn't have any idea that Johnston and his army were even close to them, right? They thought that they were 20, 30, 40 miles away, and that they'd know long before the Confederates got there that they were on their way. So honestly, the Union troops weren't paying a whole lot of attention here. And Johnston, to his credit, actually marches his troops quite a long ways, almost 60 miles in 2 days, right? So his men are marching day and night to get there and surprise the Union troops, and they actually do on the morning of April 6th. While Union troops are just waking up, starting to make their breakfast, boil their coffee, Confederate troops attack them, right? They come seemingly out of nowhere. These Confederates start shooting and attacking the Union troops. Before some of them even have their clothes or their shoes on, they're running for their lives as the Confederates attack them. The Union camp is overrun. The Union soldiers lose their supplies. Many of them didn't even grab their weapons when they were running away. About half the Union army disintegrates in the first hours of this battle. The other half, about 20,000 men, are barely hanging on. They're pushed back against a river in the area, and it looks like they're about to be wiped out. But they do fight back pretty hard, and they do slow up the Confederate attack. And in the end, Johnston decides his men are exhausted, they're running out of supplies. He's going to retreat back into the Union camps. He's going to eat all the Union food. He's going to reload his weapons with the Union munitions. And then the next day, he's going to go and finish off that Union army, right? It's only about half of it's left. He easily outnumbers them, even after the day's casualties. And it's really kind of his victory to win now. So you can kind of see they're kind of confident, right? These Confederates, they're used to winning. They kind of see things kind of going their way here. Even when the odds are kind of against them, they're able to kind of pull off victories out of seemingly nothing, right? And so there's a lot of confidence. But the next morning, as the Confederate troops get ready and they start marching out there to finish off those Union troops, they find something out. There's not 20,000 Union troops waiting for them. There's 75,000. The rest of that Union army has pulled itself together in the meantime. They've shipped in people by either train or by ship, and they've bolstered their numbers, and now it's Johnston and the Confederates that are way outnumbered. They're crushed on the second day of this battle. And in the end, that Confederate army of 44,000 is mostly wiped out. They're either captured, killed, or they just run off. And the Union avoids a really horrific defeat and instead gains a bit of a victory. Once Johnston and his army is defeated here, there's just not a lot left to defend the South. Grant, Sherman, and other Union commanders are now free to start marching down the Mississippi and slowly but surely pushing their way south. And that's exactly what happens. Over the next few months, Grant is able to move all the way down along the Mississippi River to the border between Mississippi and Louisiana. The only thing standing in his way is a town called Vicksburg, which has been turned into a Confederate fort. It dominates the Mississippi River in that area. Grant lays siege to that town for about a year. And after a year of cutting it off, isolating the town of Vicksburg so they can't send people in or out, can't bring supplies in or out, the people of Vicksburg and the Confederate forces in that city are eventually forced to surrender when they run out of food, run out of supplies, and people are dying of starvation. They surrender, and that is the last bastion of Confederate forces in the West. The Mississippi River is now completely under Union control, and they can start tearing apart any state that they want to along the Mississippi River. It just shows you just how quickly things are actually turning against the Confederacy, which explains why Lee is going to do some pretty desperate things here. And it also explains why Lincoln feels he can issue the Emancipation Proclamation just a few months later. The Union is not doing great, but it also isn't doing badly, right? It's not doing horribly. It's slowly and ponderously kind of getting the job done here. It's not quick, it's not elegant, but it definitely is slowly but surely crushing the South, especially out in the western parts of the conflict, right? So that brings us to the next moment here, right? Well, the next big battle. The first one was Antietam, then it was Shiloh, and now we're going to look at Gettysburg. And that's really the one that kind of is the culminating moment, right? It's the climactic moment of the Civil War. It is a great, huge battle with almost 200,000 troops involved in total, right? And really the stakes are high in that particular battle, right? So let's turn our attention to this. After defeats like in Shiloh, after places like Vicksburg is under siege and the Mississippi River looks like it's going to be in Union hands at any moment, Lee understands that the clock is ticking on the Confederacy. That the Union hasn't given up here, that the Union's continuing to go about doing its job, and that job is working. It's crushing the South. So in July of 1863, Lee makes a momentous decision. He's really going to roll the dice one more time here. He's going to gather up all the forces he can. He's going to strip the West of the Confederacy of basically protection, leaving the Union forces free to just invade Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee and Georgia all they want. His goal here, Lee's goal here, is to march into the North, attack the state of Pennsylvania, maybe even take the city of Philadelphia, and prove to Northerners that Lincoln can't win, that he's not an effective leader, that this war is unwinnable. And he has to make a bold stroke to prove that, right? It's got to be audacious. It's got to be staggering in its victory, right? Lee's getting desperate. He sees the handwriting on the wall. So he moves his army out of Virginia and attacks up through Maryland into southern Pennsylvania. And there in a little town of Gettysburg, Lee with an army of about 75,000 men, runs into a 100,000-man army led by Union commander George Meade. And at this little town of Gettysburg, these two massive armies square off against each other, right? July 1st, the first day of fighting, actually goes pretty well for the Confederates. They're pushing the Union back. Looks like they're going to be able to trap part of this Union army and maybe destroy it. By the second day, as Union reinforcements keep flowing in, it's stabilized. It looks like maybe the Confederates are the ones that are kind of in danger here. So on the third day of the battle, Lee decides to really put everything on the line. He's got about 13,000 troops left that haven't really seen a lot of combat yet. They're still relatively fresh. They have most of their men. They have a lot of supplies. They're ready to go. These men are under the command of a guy by the name of George Pickett. That's the man in the lower right-hand photo there. And George Pickett's job that Lee gives him is a pretty straightforward one. Take your 10,000 men, march across about a quarter mile of open ground, and break the Union lines. Force the Union army to retreat so we can destroy it and move on and prove to Northerners that this war is unwinnable. To help Pickett out, Lee has his artillery massed into one big barrage, and they attack the Union lines for hours, trying to soften them up, trying to make Union soldiers afraid so they won't shoot, so maybe they'll run, and Pickett and his men will have an easier time of crossing that open ground and attacking the Union lines. And by about 3 p.m., Pickett and his men start moving out of the trees across this open ground to attack these Union troops that are dug in on a little ridge called Seminary Ridge. And there at this in this open ground, the Union troops just wait. They really haven't been devastated by this Confederate artillery. Most of it missed them. They're pretty well protected there, and they wait. And as the Confederate troops get closer, they start opening up on them, both with their rifles and their own artillery. And within about 20 minutes' time, Pickett and 10,000 of his troops are killed, wounded, or have to run away. Now, in kind of a tribute to the audacity and the just bravery of these Confederate troops, they do something that is kind of amazing. About 400 of them actually clear this area. They make it across this open ground, run up to the Union lines, attack the Union soldiers in hand-to-hand combat, and actually drive a wedge in the Union lines. They have a chance to actually win even when things are going really badly for them. But when the Confederate commander that's in charge of this looks around, he sees that he's got a few hundred soldiers left and he's looking for more to help exploit the victory that he's about to have. He realizes there's nobody else left. It's just him and his couple hundred soldiers that have survived this attack. And when he looks up further, he notices about 2,000 Union reinforcements are marching on him. That in the end, it's over. He has to surrender, and this Confederate victory evaporates, right? It never really was going to happen anyways. There just weren't enough Confederate troops left to pull this off. In the end, this becomes a massive Union victory. The numbers are staggering here, right? Over 3 days, more than about 35,000 men are killed, wounded, or missing from this, or captured by each side, right? About 4,000 Confederates are killed, about 3,000 Union soldiers are killed. And when you stop and think about that, the North is the one that can afford these losses. The North is the one that can replace these men. True, it's going to be hard. It's going to be expensive. A lot of Northerners are tired of the war. They're already talking about quitting and going home. But in the end, there are so many people in the North, they'll be able to continue to replace these losses. The Confederacy just can't. Right? This was pretty much their one shot, their one gamble, and it just failed. In a very real way, when Pickett's charge fails on the third day of this battle, the Confederacy really does end. Now, in real terms, it's going to continue, right? The Confederacy still exists. They still have a government. They still have troops. They're still going to fight. But the war is basically lost at this point. They can't stop the Union in the East, and they certainly can't stop them any longer in the West. It's really just a matter of time now. And that's what brings us to really kind of a defining moment of this battle, right? Or this war. This battle was, from the very beginning, when it happened, a lot of people understood this was the moment, right? If the South won this battle, the North would really have to reevaluate whether this war was winnable or not. But when the North wins, now it's not a question of if the North's going to win, but when the North will successfully conclude this war. So from the moment the battle was over, a lot of people were looking at it and understood its significance. And people in the area wanted to memorialize this battle. The bravery on both sides, to be sure, but also that this was a Union victory. And as they buried the dead there, right, they started kind of sorting them out. They put the Union soldiers in one place and put the Southern soldiers in another place, right? But they were going to dedicate a national cemetery to this battle. And by November of 1863, it was ready to be dedicated. And they're going to hold a special ceremony there in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to dedicate this cemetery for all these fallen soldiers. And they invite at the time one of the most famous orators, one of the most famous speakers in the United States, a guy by the name of Edward Everett. It was kind of his job, his career was to go around lecturing people on kind of important events or important people, that kind of stuff. And he was really, really good at it. it was kind of entertainment for them, right? They don't have TV, they don't have radio, they don't have internet like we do today to entertain themselves. So they went out and listened to people that were knowledgeable speak on things, right? So that's what's going to happen here. Edward Everett's job is to come to Gettysburg and explain to the people what this battle was about and why it mattered so much. And he's going to do that. He's going to spend about a 3-hour lecture telling the audience why this battle mattered and what was important about it. But he's not the only speaker there that day. The people of Gettysburg reached out to somebody else, the President of the United States. Now, they didn't expect him to take him up on their offer, right? It's kind of a courtesy. It's like, hey, this is going to be a national cemetery. We want to make sure the President understands he's invited. If he wants to speak on behalf of all these soldiers that died here, he's more than welcome to. Well, surprisingly enough, Lincoln says yes, because Lincoln also understands this was a momentous battle, right? This one mattered more than maybe any of the others. It really did solidify the Union's eventual win here. And he wanted to kind of explain to people that the course of the war has just changed, right? That this battle mattered maybe more than any other battle. So in this at this event, Edward Everett gives his speech that goes on for like 75 minutes and then has some question and answers after it. And then the President of the United States rises and speaks. When the President is done giving his 5-minute address, it's 287 words long, this thing that we know of as the Gettysburg Address. Edward Everett turns to the President and says, "Mr. President, you said in 5 minutes what I could not say in 3 hours." Everybody there understood Lincoln had just redefined what this war was about, right? What was going on here and what was the point of it in the first place, right? His speech, the Gettysburg Address, opened up with 77 years ago. Our founding fathers brought forth upon this continent a nation conceived in liberty. And what Lincoln was saying to his audience, right, to the American people as a whole, North and South, as a matter of fact, he was saying, look, 77 years ago is a fancy way of saying, 83 years ago, right? Or 87 years ago, right? In 1776, we created a country that said we're dedicated to the idea that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, Lincoln says now we're in a war that is testing whether that's true or not. Are we about freedom or are we about slavery, right? He goes on to say that we're here on the battlefield of this war to determine whether this is true or not. Can a country that says it's about freedom and equality actually exist, right? We haven't been that nation up to that point is what he's trying to say. We've had slavery and freedom. You can't be both. We have to answer this once and for all. And what he's kind of saying is we have to answer it. One of the other lines of his speech says, look, if we don't answer this question, then all of these men have just died in vain, right? They've died for nothing. We'll just come back and have to do this all over again and all over again, right? He's saying, look, we need a new birth of freedom here. Just like we had a birth of freedom in 1776 when we declared independence, now we need to make it about truly freedom for everyone, black and white Americans, right? And in a way, he's trying to say, look, this is going to be one country again. We know that because we won this battle. And what the question is, what kind of country are we going to be? Is it going to be one that still is half free and half slave, or is it going to be all free? And Lincoln's saying it has to be all free, otherwise this war is for nothing, and we'll find ourselves in the same place we were again. Well, in some ways, this kind of electrifies the country. Newspaper people that are there print this speech verbatim as best they can remember it, right? People are looking around and say, okay, we understand. We have to deal with the issue of slavery. We can't ignore it any longer. So a big moment has happened here, right? The Union is now dedicated to, yes, holding the country together, but now once that country is held together, we're going to have to deal with slavery, right? How far do we want to go is now the question. It's not a question of if we're going to deal with slavery, it's how far do we go with slavery? Do we get rid of it completely? Do we phase it out slowly over time? Do we leave it in some places and not others, right? What is the deal here? Lincoln changes the nature of the war with his speech at Gettysburg. This country is now on its way. But of course, the war isn't over, right? As much as Lincoln's trying to appeal to Southerners, saying, "Look, we can all come together here. We can agree we're one country again, maybe a different country, but definitely one country." A lot of Southerners aren't willing to accept that. They're still fighting. They're still fighting back, if you will, right? So this war drags on for another year, year and a half. And once again, it's out west where the Union kind of sees a lot of victory. William Sherman is still out west. Ulysses S. Grant has now taken command in the east, and he's slowly but surely driving on the Confederate capital of Richmond. But it's his former lieutenant commander, right, William Sherman, that's really going to have a remarkable moment here in 1864. After the Battle of Gettysburg, Sherman pulls together a brand new army, and it's in Tennessee, and he decides he's going to do something audacious on his own, right? Kind of taking a cue from Lee. He's going to take his army deep into the South. He's not going to worry about bringing more troops with him. He's not going to worry about bringing supplies with him. He's just going to march into the South, grab Confederate supplies, grab Confederate food, and use that to sustain his army and just tear the South apart. And there in September of 1864, he does just that. Between July and September, he leaves Tennessee with his 60,000-man army and goes into the South and starts crushing it, slowly but surely, right? He takes the city of Atlanta, one of the biggest cities in the South, and moves on south into the rest of Georgia. And for about 60 miles in any direction from his army, he destroys everything in his path. And we mean not just soldiers, but homes, farms. He doesn't care. He destroys it all. Bridges, railroads, he tears it apart. He truly destroys a small section of the South. For him, he described it as war is hell, and they need to understand that, right? He wants Southerners to understand what it's like to lose a war. And he frees slaves left and right under the auspices of the Emancipation Proclamation. By December of 1864, he has cut Georgia in two. He's cut off another section of the Confederacy, and it's proved that this war is all but over. Now, it's still going to go on for several more months, but when Sherman marches through Georgia and the Confederacy can't stop them, it's proof that this war is lost for the Confederacy. But it is so brutal and it is so impactful that a lot of Southerners are going to look at Sherman and think, Northerners are awful, Northerners are vicious, Northerners are doing horrible things. Now, true, some of this is pretty awful, but it's no different than what Lee's troops were doing as they marched into Maryland and Pennsylvania. So it's just the fact that Lee's troops didn't get to stay there and do it for as long that really made it a big difference. But in the end, resentment is going to be lengthened. It means that when the war is over, a lot of white Southerners are going to look back at this moment and say, look at how aggressive the North was. Look at how awful they were compared to us. And that brings us to kind of the conclusion of all of this, right, of the Civil War. And a few months after Sherman's victories, right, and Lincoln has been reelected now in November of 1864, it is obvious the war is over. Grant keeps driving down into Virginia, and eventually Lee is forced to surrender in April of 1865. And as the Confederacy crumbles and soldiers start heading home and giving up, the question is, what comes next? One black soldier, one of those 180,000 former slaves that joined the Union soldiers, right? He sees his former owner walking by one day, right, as he's watching these Confederates go home in defeat. And he waves to his master and says, hello, master, bottom rail on top now. What he's trying to say is, look, you used to be in control of me, now I'm in control of you. But is that true, right? What happens next? Lincoln has said that we need to end slavery, but what does that look like? What does that mean? Is it truly equality? Are blacks and whites equal? Or is there going to be some system here, right? Blacks are not equal to whites, but they're not slaves, right? What is going to take place now? What happens now that the war is winding down? Well, we're not sure what Lincoln's ideas were going to be, right? We kind of have a clue that he wanted to end the war as quickly as possible, but in the once the war was over, he had some pretty sweeping ideas, maybe giving some blacks the right to vote, definitely the end to slavery. He's pushed through the 13th Amendment through Congress, and it's now being ratified by the states, ending legally slavery throughout the country. So the question isn't, is slavery gone? It is how far equality is going to be extended to black Americans. But before that question could be answered, Lincoln is assassinated. He goes on April 14th to Ford's Theater. He's assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in his presidential box as he's watching the play. Booth escapes, and the nation is in mourning, right? What's going to happen next? Who's going to take over this momentous decision of what happens to the country now, right? And that's a kind of a big question, because Lincoln's vice president is a former slave-owning Southerner by the name of Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson's going to have to decide what happens now that the war is over. How do you rebuild a country? Or as historians have described this period, how do you reconstruct the nation, right? And that's what we'll pick up in our next lecture. All right, guys, thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.